Quebec has over 400 years of recorded history. 400 years of churches built on rock, of institutions carved into the landscape, of communities that rose and collapsed and were never properly mourned. And somewhere in all of that, between the official timelines and the heritage plaques and the carefully curated museum exhibits, there are places that didn't make it into the story. Not because they were forgotten, because someone decided they should be. That's the thing about Quebec's abandoned places that sets them apart. It's not decay, it's not neglect. Drive through rural Quebec, ask locals about certain buildings, certain sites, certain names, and watch what happens. The conversation doesn't trail off awkwardly. It stops, clean, deliberate, like a door closing. These are 13 of those places. They start strange and they get heavier. By the end, the question won't be what happened inside these walls. It'll be why nobody talks about it. There's a mill in the eastern townships that you can see from the highway if you know where to look. 7 stories of red brick, windows long gone, roof partially collapsed on the eastern side. It's been standing like that since the late 1980s. Just standing. No fencing, no demolition order, no preservation designation. Just there. It opened in 1887 and at its peak employed close to 300 people from the surrounding villages. Wool, mostly. Then cotton. The kind of operation that shaped a region's entire weekly rhythm. Shift changes, paydays. The sound of the looms that you could hear from the road even with the windows shut. It closed during a labor dispute that never got resolved. Management locked the doors one January and never came back. Workers showed up for 3 weeks straight before accepting it was over. Some of them had worked there for 25 years. The building has been sitting in a legal gray zone ever since. The original company dissolved. The land changed hands twice through corporate restructuring. Nobody currently owns it in any clear, actionable sense, which means nobody is responsible for it, and nobody can do anything with it. What's interesting is that the surrounding towns never pushed for demolition. You'd think there'd be pressure. Instead, there's this quiet, unspoken agreement to just leave it. A few locals told researchers in the 2000s that the mill felt like a grave marker, that tearing it down would mean having to explain what it was a grave for. This one requires a bit of geography. Lac Frontière sits right at the Quebec-Maine border, about as far south as the province goes before it runs out of land. In the 1940s and 50s, there was a small customs and transit station here. A cluster of buildings that processed travelers, held short-term detainees, and served as a regional post for the RCMP. By 1971, it had been decommissioned. New infrastructure, new routes, new border protocols. The buildings weren't demolished. They were simply vacated, and the keys, apparently, were never properly transferred anywhere. So they sat. What's unusual about this site isn't the physical decay, though the decay is significant. It's the paperwork found inside during an unauthorized entry documented in the 1990s. Customs logs, correspondence, detainee records from the 1940s and 50s. Most of it dealt with routine crossings, but some of it documented cases that would be deeply uncomfortable by contemporary standards. Detentions of people who weren't criminals. Holds that went on longer than regulations permitted. Notes written in a bureaucratic language that made ordinary cruelty sound completely procedural. The records were never formally archived. They're still there, or they were. Nobody with institutional authority has ever gone in to retrieve them. Built in 1923 in a small town north of Sherbrooke, the Hotel Beaumont was designed specifically to attract American tourists coming up from Vermont and New Hampshire. Grand lobby, 42 rooms, a dining hall that reportedly served cuisine that had no business being that good in a town that small. For about 15 years, it worked. Prohibition drove a lot of Americans north, and the Beaumont caught some of that traffic. After Prohibition ended, the clientele dried up. The hotel adapted, repositioned, survived the Depression somehow, limped through the post-war years catering to traveling salesmen and regional conferences. By 1974, it closed permanently. The building sat untouched for decades. Then something complicated happened. The land it sits on turned out to be subject to a territorial claim by a local Abenaki community that predated the municipality itself. The provincial government has a counter-position. Neither side has moved to demolish, develop, or formally occupy the structure, while the claim is unresolved. So the Beaumont stands in a kind of suspended legal reality. It belongs to no one, or to two different parties simultaneously, depending on which legal framework you apply. The wallpaper in the lobby, a pattern of dark green vines, is still largely intact. The front desk register from the final week of operation is still open on the counter. Nobody touched it on the way out. There were dozens of institutions like this across Quebec, Catholic orphanages that operated under church authority through much of the 20th century. Saint-Cécile was one of the smaller ones, housing between 40 and 80 children at any given time between 1912 and 1968. It closed when the provincial government began the long process of secularizing Quebec's social services infrastructure, what historians call the Quiet Revolution's institutional dismantling. The children were transferred. The nuns were reassigned or retired. The building was handed to the municipality, which had no immediate use for it and no funds to maintain it. What makes Saint-Cécile notable in the context of this list is a specific detail. It was one of the institutions later identified in provincial investigations into the Duplessis orphans, the children who were reclassified as mentally ill in the 1940s and 50s, so Quebec could receive federal funding designated for psychiatric patients rather than orphans. Thousands of children across the province were affected. Some were subjected to conditions and treatments that would not survive any reasonable ethical scrutiny. Saint-Cécile appeared in the margins of those investigations, not as a central site, not definitively, but it appeared. The building was never designated, never formally investigated as a site. The municipality has received multiple development proposals over the years and quietly declined each one. Nobody, as far as any public record shows, has ever explained why. This is where the list starts to get stranger. The Sisters of Immaculate Silence were a small contemplative order, enclosed, meaning they didn't leave the convent, didn't engage with the public, barely even communicated with the broader church hierarchy. They operated a convent outside a small town in the Laurentians from 1891 until sometime in the 1960s. The sometime is part of the problem. There's no formal dissolution date on record, no announcement of closure. The order simply ceased to appear in church registries after approximately 1963. The building didn't transfer to diocesan control through any documented process. It was just no longer mentioned. Inside, and this has been documented by urban explorers and researchers who entered the building in the 2000s, the cells are intact. Each room has a small wooden placard on the door with a nun's name. 31 names in total. The chapel still has its altar cloth, discolored but present. The kitchen has cookware still in the cupboards. What happened to 31 women who lived in complete enclosure is genuinely unclear. There are no death records linked to the convent, no transfer records. The order doesn't appear in any current church database, active or dissolved. The local parish priest, when contacted by a journalist in 2009, said he didn't know the property and had never been to that road. The convent is clearly visible from the main road. It has been there for over 100 years, not a military installation in the modern sense. In the mid-19th century, the term garrison was used loosely to describe any fortified administrative post. This one was built by the provincial government around 1858 and served a function that the records describe only as civil order maintenance. It's a small stone building. 2 stories, thick walls, no windows on the ground floor. The kind of architecture that was designed to keep people in as much as out. Regional records from the 1860s reference it sporadically in connection with suppression of land disputes between tenant farmers and the seigneurial class. Beyond that, documentation is thin. The building has never been studied seriously. It's too small to be a military heritage site and too obscure to have attracted academic attention. It sits on a rural lot that was sold to a private owner in 1987 who has never developed it. People who grew up nearby sometimes refer to it in conversation, but always vaguely, as the old stone building, as if naming it more precisely would require knowing more about it than they want to. This one is less atmospheric and more straightforward, which almost makes it worse. An asbestos mining operation that ran from 1934 to 1979. Asbestos extraction was Quebec's industry for decades. The province was one of the world's largest producers, and the economic argument for continuing always outweighed the health evidence against it. Saint-Tite-de-Caps was a mid-sized operation. When it closed, it left behind not just structures, but contamination. Soil, groundwater, the surrounding residential areas where workers had lived for generations. The cleanup was partial. Government-funded remediation addressed the most visible contamination. The deeper contamination, the kind that takes decades to manifest in human health, was addressed with studies and recommendations and follow-up assessments that fed into other studies. The physical structures, processing buildings, administrative offices, storage facilities, were left standing in a contamination buffer zone. You can't build there, you can't farm there, you technically shouldn't be there at all. But the buildings are still there, inside the zone, quietly continuing to deteriorate. Workers from this mine and others like it across Quebec have been dying of mesothelioma and related cancers for decades. Their children have organized. Their grandchildren have organized. The buildings stand in poisoned ground, and the official position has been, for a long time, that further action is pending. A small regional hospital that operated from 1911 to 1989. Nothing unusual about the history of the institution itself. It served the community, it aged, it was superseded by newer facilities in larger centers. It closed. Standard trajectory for dozens of rural Quebec hospitals in the late 20th century. What makes it different is what happened after closure. A local heritage group inventoried the building in the early 1990s and found patient records going back to the 1910s. Hundreds of files, some dating from the influenza epidemic of 1918. Medical records in the technical sense, but also something more. Correspondence, personal notes from attending physicians, letters from families, the kind of material that tells you what it was actually like to be sick in rural Quebec in the first half of the 20th century. The group flagged the records to provincial archival authorities. The response was slow. Institutional archiving takes time, resources, political will. The group waited. The building continued to deteriorate. A section of roof collapsed in 2003, exposing part of the record storage area to weather. Some of the older files were lost. The provincial archive eventually moved to retrieve what remained. By that point, roughly 40% of the collection had been destroyed by water damage. 40% of the records gone, not deliberately, not maliciously. Just through the particular Quebec combination of bureaucratic inertia and physical decay that this list keeps returning to. The building is still standing. The remaining 60% of the records are in archival storage somewhere, technically preserved, practically inaccessible. This is the one that hits differently. Not a single building, a whole community. Or what was a community? Rivière-du-Moulin was a company town built by a pulp and paper corporation in the 1910s in the Saguenay region. At peak operation in the 1950s, over 900 families lived there. The company owned the houses, the school, the general store, the recreational facilities. The workers were paid in wages that they spent largely in company-owned establishments. It was a closed economic system that the company designed and the workers inhabited, and that, in the specific way these things work, nobody questioned too directly, because the alternative was unemployment in a region with few alternatives. The mill closed in 1981. Without warning. The company sent notices on a Friday. By Monday, the town had ceased to function as an economic unit. Over the following decade, the population dispersed. The company sold the housing stock at minimal prices. The infrastructure was too degraded to be worth much. Families who had lived there for 3 generations left within a few years. The company dissolved its local corporate entities and the legal obligations attached to them. By 2000, the remaining structures were largely abandoned. The school had been used as a community center for a while, then that closed too. The church held services until 2008. What's hardest to process isn't the physical abandonment. It's the demographic one. There are no children there now. There haven't been for years. The people who grew up in Rivière-du-Moulin are scattered across Quebec and beyond. Some of them have tried to organize reunions, to maintain some collective memory. But the place they're remembering doesn't exist anymore, and it was taken away from them in a single Friday afternoon letter. The mill structure is still partially standing. Nobody is rushing to demolish it. Built in 1949 as an expansion of an existing psychiatric facility in Montreal, Mont Providence became, over the following 2 decades, one of the larger psychiatric institutions in Quebec. At one point housing over 1,000 patients in conditions that a 1961 internal government inspection described, in careful bureaucratic language, as requiring substantial review. The Quiet Revolution brought reform. Some of it was genuine. Deinstitutionalization reduced patient populations across Quebec's psychiatric system through the 1970s and 80s. Mont-Providence scaled back, closed wards, eventually ceased admissions entirely in 1993. The last patients were transferred to community care settings that were, in many cases, underfunded and inadequately staffed. But that's a different story. The Pavilion building was officially closed and locked. The plan was always to demolish it. The plan has remained a plan for over 30 years. Inside, and photographs from various unauthorized entries exist. There are still patient charts in the nursing stations. Not all of them, but enough. There are restraint beds still bolted to the floors of certain rooms. There are murals on the walls of a common room painted by patients in the 1970s as part of an art therapy program. Hands and trees and blue skies rendered in hospital-issue paint on concrete walls. The murals are still there. The people who painted them are gone. Dispersed, deceased, or somewhere in the community care system that replaced this place. Nobody cataloged the art. Nobody photographed it formally before the building closed. The murals exist now in a locked building that is slowly falling apart, seen only by people who shouldn't be there. There are former patients and their families who have asked, repeatedly, for access to their own records. Some requests have been answered, many have not. The records exist, the building exists. The institution, legally speaking, does not. It was dissolved, and its obligations transferred to a successor entity that itself underwent restructuring several times. At some point in that chain of transfers, the specific obligation to provide former patients with their own histories seems to have gotten lost. This one is strange in a way that resists easy explanation. There is a school, a physical building that still stands in a rural area east of Quebec City, that appears in regional education records through 1962 and then simply stops appearing. No closure notice, no enrollment records after that date, no record of the building being transferred to municipal ownership, no demolition permit, no explanation in any accessible administrative record for why a functioning school serving a documented student population just ceases to exist in the paper trail. The building is there. Anyone can see it. It has never been demolished, never been repurposed, never been formally identified as surplus property. It just stopped being mentioned. Researchers who have looked into this have proposed various explanations. Clerical error in archival organization, transfer of records between diocesan and provincial authority that created a gap, a building that was informally maintained by the local community without proper administrative continuation. Maybe. All of those are possible. But here is what's also true. A local historian who spent 3 years trying to trace the school's post-1962 history said, in an interview, that every time she got close to an answer, she found another silence. Not a missing record. A silence. People who knew the area well, who had lived there their whole lives, who had answers to every other question she asked. When the school came up, they gave her the same look. A look she described as not ignorance, deliberate non-engagement. She never published her findings. She moved on to other projects. This one requires some context, and the context is uncomfortable. Maurice Duplessis was Premier of Quebec from 1936 to 1939, and again from 1944 until his death in 1959. His administration, known as the Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness, operated a Quebec that was socially conservative, politically authoritarian, and deeply intertwined with the Catholic Church in every dimension of public life. Under his government, Quebec's orphanages struck a deal with the federal government. Psychiatric patients generated more federal funding than orphans. So orphaned children, thousands of them, were reclassified. Medical professionals signed papers diagnosing children with conditions they didn't have. The children were transferred to psychiatric institutions and subjected to treatments designed for adult psychiatric patients. Some were lobotomized. Some died. Most survived into adulthood carrying diagnoses that followed them for the rest of their lives, making employment, housing, and legal standing deeply difficult to achieve. The Duplessis orphans, as they came to be called, spent decades organizing and advocating for recognition. The Quebec government formally acknowledged the injustice in 1999. A limited compensation program was established. The Catholic Church issued an apology in 2015. The buildings where these things happened, the institutions, the asylums, are scattered across the province. Some have been demolished. Some have been repurposed. Some are on this list. What's never been fully resolved is the records. There are institutional records from this period that have never been made fully accessible to survivors or their descendants. The argument has always been one of privacy, of process, of administrative complexity. Survivors have been dying. The oldest of them are now in their 70s and 80s. The buildings that remain standing from this period carry something that is hard to name precisely. It's not haunting in the ghost story sense. It's more like standing in a place where a crime was committed and no one was ever formally charged, where the evidence was never fully examined, where the victims are still waiting. Some of those buildings are locked. Some are not. Either way, nobody goes in. There is a facility. The name of it, the precise location, is something this documentary has chosen not to disclose, and in a moment you'll understand why. That sits at the intersection of everything this list has been building toward. It was a psychiatric institution. It operated within the Duplessis era. It received orphaned children. It was affiliated with a religious order. It closed, officially, in the early 1970s. Its records were transferred to a diocesan archive that was itself reorganized in the 1990s. In the reorganization, a significant portion of the records from this institution were classified as administratively closed, a designation that, under current provincial access law, means they cannot be requested by members of the public. The building still stands. It is in a small municipality in the Mauricie region. The local government is aware of it. Local residents are aware of it. When journalists have attempted to report on this facility, they have encountered something specific. Not denial exactly, but a quality of non-cooperation that is different from bureaucratic obstruction. A local official in 2017 told a reporter, off the record, that the building was known, that word specifically, and that there had been a collective, informal decision in the community that it was better to leave it alone. Not to demolish it, not to investigate it, just to leave it alone. The reporter asked, why not demolish it? The official said that demolishing it would require permits, assessments, contractors. It would require a process. And a process would require naming the building officially. And naming it officially would open the records question. So it stands, known to everyone, visited by no one. The municipality maintains the road that passes it. The road is kept clear in winter. The building is, in every practical sense, present in the community's daily geography. And in every other sense, it does not exist. That's the thing about Quebec's abandoned places that this list kept circling back to. The ones that stay standing aren't the ones nobody cares about. They're the ones that too many people care about in too complicated a way. Demolition requires intention. Restoration requires confrontation. Silence, the specific, chosen, maintained silence of a community that knows exactly what it's not saying, requires nothing at all. It just requires time and patience and the reasonable hope that eventually the people who remember will be gone. Some of them already are.